Hello, this is Rebecca from Seawolf Sustainability Consulting. It's my real pleasure to present the second part of my conversation with Stephen Huyton, a former finance director. We'll talk about topics ranging from short-termism in financials and financial decision through to sustainability. Part two of our conversation is a little bit different because I've used some AI generated avatars. Please bear with me because it's not perfect. It was a little bit of an experiment and somewhat limited by my own technical skills. However, I would be really curious to see how you find this AI version with the avatars, and also how you think it compares to listening to the actual real humans on a video. Thank you for watching. Bye.
Curious to pick on the point you mentioned about short-termism and where you think this comes from. Over-reliance on data, financial statements. Is it coming from consumers? I was just curious to get your personal perspective on that.
Well, I think it's something we have all witnessed, haven't we? We live in a world now where we're all about instant gratification in one form or another. You look at the soundbite story from politicians. People are not willing to listen any longer, and I think that translates into everything that we do. People want instant results. People want instant numbers. In finance in particular, everything's got to be instant today, tomorrow, but not in a year's time. When you look at the political agenda, and unless you're China, then everybody else's agenda is quite short-term. It takes a brave politician to look beyond the next election, and that is the same as in business. Now, being a bit cynical, but a lot of companies, of course, they look at the next round of reporting, and the cycle of changes at CEO level is something else that you see. A new CEO comes in. They expect a tenure for the majority of 3 to 5 years. Very few CEOs have a long-term tenure. Most of them are quite short-term. So in the very short term, they have tried to create an environment in which their financials, in 3 or 5 years, looks successful. They put all the blame on everybody else for what that went before them. So everybody looks and forgets what's gone on in the past and looks to for promises of the future. And then, of course, you've got to measure those. So it's all very short-termist. And that translates itself because that's exactly. You could argue, we talked about ESG reporting, and ESG reporting is it's a concept, isn't it? It's a set of measurements, and smaller companies find it almost impossible to measure. And yet that reporting that, in the end, it's supposed to help companies make strategic decisions, but those decisions are longer-term decisions. So you are really running up against a conflict between the short and long term. What big companies require for the markets could be against what the ESG reporting might be telling you as a company that you should be looking for the longer profit tomorrow. The two things in actual fact can conflict more than they actually complement one another. And it's only companies that have that long-term vision that can actually say and demonstrate over a long period of time. And without getting into the politics of equality reporting, that's a good example. Companies that demonstrate diversity and equality over time, it's clear that their results don't necessarily immediately deliver on the bottom line. So that's the conflict that we face, I think, at the moment, short-termism.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely that tension. And in another aspect, sustainability, which I have been working on. It just takes time to restore nature, fisheries, planting trees, whatever it may be. So yeah, there's that tension there. You start to calculate payback periods or put that into a discount cash flow model or view the rate of return, you can find challenges. Acceptance that capital is patient is really difficult with this short-term instant gratification style culture.
Yeah. And then unless governments are prepared to provide incentive, and that invariably means some form of tax incentive to encourage companies to look beyond the short-term horizon, then you're always going to have that conflict, The very nature of capitalism, you've got to be able to demonstrate. It's all about allocating resources, the conditions of capitalism is that in itself it doesn't always look at the longer term. Sometimes it does, but in the age we live in now, with the rapidly changing world we're living in and the impact we're seeing on the environment around us and global warming. I picked up the news this morning and you see that Asia's facing huge heat waves. I have just been a month in Spain, but the weather's been unusually warm. We have got huge fires in the south and southern France, and I had lunch with a colleague in London a week ago, and he's from Milan and he's lived in London for 25 years. And he said to me, Stephen, the weather is the same in London now as we have generally had in Milan 25 years ago. So for him, there are these tangible changes. He says Milan is now just incredibly hot in the summer months. And it's happening faster, those changes. That in itself brings the need for change, which has got to be led by governments. And we see how they're all struggling. Companies have got a self-interest, from the point of view of their resources. Think about the simple fact of air conditioning environments. In an office environment, there is not automatically aircon, plus neither is this in systems throughout a factory. They are expensive, and they also eat resources and they don't have a deliverable on the bottom line. But without them, it will impact the work that's done in the company. And these first changes are going to happen very quickly. And they're all going to be impacting upon the way the business operates in the coming time and how finance responds. With these needs for tomorrow and the short-termism, that's going to be an interesting challenge.
Sure. And so thinking again of that finance director perspective and some of maybe what you have seen over your career and what you are doing now, I am incredibly envious of you recently spending a month in Spain. Either inside or outside a company, what reflections you have about this finance director perspective?
Well, the biggest thing that I've learned is when I left the UK and started working in the Netherlands. It is how important culture is. That's been my biggest learning. Communicating in effective ways across a variety of different cultures in a finance function is very important, especially with different operations in different countries. Getting everybody to have their noses in the same direction at the same time, working from the same hymn sheet, as they say in English. It's always quite a challenge, and therefore, culture was important for me. The most important thing that I identified as being a key takeaway is that we don't appreciate the differences in culture. And every country does it, even within the country. You hear the jokes in France about people in Paris thinking everybody outside Paris are peasants. And you talk about London to the people in the UK, and people from London looking at everybody who lives north of Milton Keynes as an absolute horror, and so on. And they don't understand one or another. And that's a cultural difference within the country. So when you are talking about my biggest personal takeaway, it is this, coupled with how important languages are. You and I just started this morning talking about using Duolingo. It took me long enough to learn Dutch, and now I am learning Spanish. I now see how important languages are, and I regret not learning earlier. Some people make huge efforts, and I think that for some countries, the UK being a good example, where languages are not seen as being terribly important. And again, in the finance function, these areas are terribly important for a multinational. The company I worked for was a multinational US corporation. Everything was dollar-orientated. Understanding different cultures and languages was almost impossible. They didn't do it. It's a huge country in the US, and I understand it. But if you want to engage people in other countries and get them really motivated, then you have to be able to communicate well. Although my two big takeaways from a personal point of view are things that underpin business. As a finance director, I will go back to where I started this conversation by saying, you can't be a good finance director if you don't understand the business. If you don't understand how the shop floor works, for example, to explain if your bank manager comes around to visit, or a private equity comes for an inspection, or whatever it might be. If you don't understand the production process itself, I find it very hard to understand how you can adequately interpret the financials that are presented to you, and adequately, therefore, plan strategically, set the strategy for the business. Does that help you?
It does, yes. It's really interesting, and actually I was thinking about culture because there is a link to AI, which we mentioned during the call, and I was just reading an article yesterday, and it was about a lot of the data that goes into AI is in English, and so you have got models which are trained in a particular way with a particular bias. And so as you were talking, I was thinking, there's that human element piece coming in there. So humans, technology, and the importance of the culture, and how, to what extent is that integrated? I must admit that's beyond my knowledge of AI.
Really interesting. There was a piece in the Dutch press, I can't quote the exact source, but it said it's already dominated by the English-speaking world. The Dutch language is not so widely spoken, relatively speaking. So therefore, search engines are still getting used to the different languages, and they made that point actually. It's skewed towards a response where the AI searches. It looks at the English language as its first source of information. So it's a very valid point. Yeah, indeed.
And then final question, and I might know the answer because it might be, go to back and learn a language earlier, but if you could sort of go back, and what advice would you give your former self looking back?
Well, my children were lucky enough to go to the international school in Amsterdam. Among the things that they get taught at the IB program is lifelong learning, and pushing your boundaries and being prepared to step outside your comfort envelope. For me, that was part of my decision when I moved abroad to step outside my own comfort envelope. I couldn't stay doing what I was doing. I wanted a new challenge. I think that's caused me to constantly push my envelope. My regret, as I said before, is my failure to pick up more languages, particularly German. I have to be honest. But I think that the approach to lifelong learning has been the thing that I've appreciated most and learned actually from my children. How important it is that you should never stop that learning. It doesn't matter what age you are.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Any sort of final words or thoughts before we close off?
No, not really. It's been an interesting discussion. My personal view is that we're in for a rocky ride in the next few years. I know your background is very much into sustainability. That's Seawolf today. That's your business. I've listened to some of the previous podcasts that you've done. I have to say at the moment, I'm rather pessimistic. I think there is a big pushback, and I think companies are finding it too easy to use the political background to undo and unpick some of the things they've done because it's no longer seen as being good politics to be reporting in this way. So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done in that respect. And it comes at a time when the world around us and the environment is changing so fast. It's exactly the opposite of what we need at the moment. So I have to say that my conclusion is that the next few years will be hard. So a bit of a downer to finish, but I think it's typical of an accountant, realistic.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I think about how I feel about the environmental situation today. It sometimes really depends on what mood I'm in and sometimes what article I have just read. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate the time.